It all started in the summer of 2018 when my girlfriend, Mia, and I decided to escape the city for a quiet weekend in a secluded beachfront Airbnb in Montauk, out in the Hamptons. We'd been together for almost 3 years and, both of us busy with work, figured it was the perfect getaway for some much-needed time alone. The house was a classic New England-style beach cottage, perched above the sand dunes with a wraparound porch and stunning views of the ocean. From the photos, it looked both cozy and remote, everything we were looking for. We arrived early on a Friday and spent the first day in bliss. The beach was deserted, just endless stretches of sand and waves crashing rhythmically. After hours lounging in the sun and taking dips in the small pool behind the house, we cleaned up and decided to check out a local bar that the Airbnb owner had recommended. The night was cool, the bar lively but not too crowded, exactly our vibe. It was the sort of carefree evening that felt almost surreal, like nothing could possibly go wrong. We returned to the house a little tipsy, laughing and talking about future trips. It wasn't until the second day that things started to get strange. That morning, we went back to the beach, and after some time in the sun, decided to call it a day. As we packed up, Mia was about to lock up the beach stuff when I glanced up at the house. And that's when I saw it. On the top floor, right at the edge of a window, there was a figure. Someone was standing there, watching us. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of the sun casting odd shadows. But as I squinted and focused, I was certain I saw a man standing in that window, staring down at us. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. "Hey, Mia," I murmured, trying to sound casual so I wouldn't freak her out. But when I pointed it out, and we both looked up again, there was nothing. The window was empty. "Probably just your imagination," Mia said, laughing it off, though I could tell she was a little unnerved. I tried to shake it off too, but the image of that figure lingered in my mind. Was someone in our rental? It was supposed to be just us, and we hadn't heard anyone else in the house. That night, after another evening at the bar, we returned to find the house shrouded in complete darkness. There were no lights on, and I mean none. Not even the porch light, which I was certain we'd left on. I fumbled around, searching for the light switch, but nothing worked. Not a single lamp, not the overhead lights, nothing. We pulled out our phones and used their flashlights to light our way, but still, I couldn't find the breaker box or any sign of what had gone wrong. Mia was starting to panic, and I wasn't far from it myself. "We should just go to bed," she whispered, as if speaking loudly would somehow make things worse. "We'll sort it out in the morning." Reluctantly, I agreed, though a part of me wanted to drive into town right then and there, find a hotel, or even just sleep in the car. But we headed upstairs and crawled into bed, keeping our phones nearby just in case. It must have been hours later when I woke up to the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Mia, maybe heading to the bathroom, but when I turned over, I saw her lying beside me, fast asleep. My heart began to race, every nerve on edge. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear any movement. Then I saw it. A shadow drifted across the small gap under the door, moving slowly, deliberately. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. I was half convinced I was dreaming, but it was so vivid, so real, I knew I couldn't be. The shadow paused outside our door, and in that moment, I knew that someone was there, just feet away from us. I reached over, shaking Mia awake as quietly as I could. She woke with a start, her eyes wide with confusion, and I pointed to the door. Then, as if on cue, there was a loud, persistent knock. Not a polite knock, but a hard, almost violent pounding that echoed through the house. "Who is it?" Mia whispered, panic creeping into her voice. A man's voice answered from the other side, gravelly and thick. "It's the landlord. Here to fix the power." The voice was cold, flat. There was something off about it, something that sent chills down my spine. I whispered back to Mia. "We never called anyone. The owner said he wasn't even in the area this weekend." She nodded, her face pale. It was true. I'd exchanged texts with the owner that morning, and he had said he was away for the week. I cleared my throat, trying to sound calm. "We're fine. Thanks, but we'll call the owner if we need anything. There was silence, long and unsettling, then a loud scraping sound as the doorknob jiggled, then twisted back and forth. The man started pounding harder, his voice a low growl. "Let me in. I'm here to fix the power." We both held our breath, praying he would just go away. I locked the door, my hand shaking as I turned the small knob, and backed away from it, pulling Mia with me. The pounding continued relentless, each knock reverberating through the floor. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, stretching on and until I thought I'd go mad from the tension. We waited, frozen, for any sound, any indication of movement outside. But there was nothing. Eventually, Mia whispered, "Should we call the police?" I nodded and, with trembling hands, dialed 911. I whispered the details as quietly as I could, terrified that whoever was outside could hear me. The dispatcher assured us they'd send someone right away, but it felt like ages before we finally saw the flashing lights outside. The police entered through the front, and as they made their way upstairs, they assured us they'd checked the entire property, but they found no sign of anyone. The front door had been left ajar, but no other evidence that anyone had been there, other than a few faint scuff marks near our bedroom door. They restored the power after finding the breaker switch strangely flipped off in the basement, a place we hadn't even known existed. By sunrise, Mia and I were packed and out the door. Neither of us wanted to stay in that house another second. As we drove away, exhausted and shaken, I dialed the number of the Airbnb owner, determined to find out what had happened. When he answered, I explained everything, every detail, and as I finished, he fell silent. "I'm not sure what to tell you," he said finally, sounding just as disturbed as we felt. "But I haven't been near Montauk in weeks, and there's no one else with the key to the house. To this day, I have no explanation for who, or what, was in that house with us that night." The first time I bought a house, I thought it was the beginning of something fresh, maybe even perfect. I'd finally saved enough to get this little two-story place in a quiet suburb. It wasn't the newest or biggest, but it had charm, hardwood floors, a gabled attic, and a little garden out back. I was thrilled, and to celebrate, I invited a few friends over to help me move in and have a drink or two. One of my friends, Jason, was helping me with the boxes when he paused, tilting his head like he was listening for something. I didn't think much of it, but he said he'd heard a faint knocking sound coming from inside the walls. I laughed it off, saying it was probably just the old pipes or the house settling. He shrugged it off too, and we went back to hauling boxes. But later that night, when I was finally alone, settling into my first night as a homeowner, I started hearing the sounds myself. It started as a soft scratching, almost like something rubbing against the ceiling. My bedroom was on the top floor, so technically, the only thing above me was the attic. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, old houses make noises. But as I lay there in the dark, the scratching grew louder, turning into a slow, deliberate tapping. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving around above me. It's strange, but I almost felt like it was watching me. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and it smelled old, like stale wood and something else I couldn't quite place, something sour. I scanned the flashlight across the room, only to find a couple of old, faded paintings leaning against the wall. They were portraits, maybe of previous owners or people related to them. They looked out of place, almost like they'd been hidden up there on purpose. But there was nothing else, no animal or intruder, so I chalked it up to my nerves and went back downstairs. Just as I was about to fall asleep, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder, almost rhythmic, like something was trying to get out. I couldn't sleep with that noise. Convinced that some animal had made a nest in my walls, I grabbed a flashlight and headed back up to the attic, ready to search every corner until I found whatever was making the noise. When I reached the attic, the air felt different, colder somehow, and heavy. I shone the flashlight over to where the paintings were leaning against the wall. only to realize that one of them had shifted slightly, like someone, or something, had pushed it. With my heart pounding, I reached out to move the painting, and that's when I noticed it, a dark hole in the wall, large enough for a person to crawl through. My pulse quickened, but I couldn't resist the urge to look closer. Suddenly, from out of the darkness, a figure shot forward. She was pale, almost deathly so, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into her skull. Her hair was matted and tangled, and her fingers were long and claw-like. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her nails tearing into my shoulder as I staggered back, yelling in terror. I felt her nails scraping my skin, sharp and cold, like shards of glass. I managed to push her back, slamming the painting against the hole as I bolted down the stairs, locking the attic door behind me. I stood there, panting, my shoulder burning from where she clawed me. My mind raced, unable to process what had just happened. Who was she? How long had she been there, hiding in that hidden space? In a panic, I called the police, explaining that there was someone living in my attic, someone dangerous. They arrived within minutes, and I led them upstairs, still shaking from the encounter. I could see they were skeptical, until they saw the scratch marks on my shoulder. One of the officers went up to the attic, his flashlight bouncing off the walls as he moved. I heard a struggle, followed by frantic footsteps. After a few moments, the officers managed to pull her out of the hole and restrain her, despite her wild, frenzied resistance. As they led her past me, I got one more look at her face. She didn't look at me with anger or fear, but with an emptiness that chilled me to the core. It was as if she were staring through me, into something far beyond. After they took her away, one of the officers suggested I check the space she'd been hiding in, just to see if there was anything else I should be aware of. Nervously, I climbed back into the attic, this time with all the lights on. The hidden room behind the wall was a grim sight. Old blankets and pillows were scattered around, stained with dirt and something darker. There were empty food wrappers, bottles of water, and the unmistakable stench of human waste. It was a makeshift nest, and it was clear that she'd been living there for quite some time, maybe even before I'd moved in. The thought made my skin crawl. How long had she been there, silently watching me from the walls? Had she been the one making those noises, scratching and tapping, trying to get my attention? The police told me they'd taken her to a psychiatric facility, and that she was likely suffering from severe mental health issues. But the whole thing left me with more questions than answers. Who was she? How had she ended up living in my attic? And why had she stayed hidden, lurking in the darkness, until now? It was the kind of house I'd always dreamed of, a quiet, unassuming, two-story home with a decent-sized yard and enough space to settle into on my own. At 28, I was more than ready to make the leap into home ownership, but I'll be honest, I couldn't have done it without a little help from my dad. It was a fixer-upper for sure, a house that had seen its fair share of history, but I liked that. I thought it gave the place some character. The previous owners, I learned from the realtor, had been an elderly couple. The husband had passed away years before, and the widow had just recently passed, only a few weeks before I signed the papers. Their son, a man in his 50s, had left a lot of their old furniture in the house, which I was free to keep or toss. Among the relics was a shabby old rocking chair, a creaky, stained piece of work that looked like it had sat in the same spot for decades. I didn't like it. In fact, it made me a little uneasy, though I couldn't quite say why. So I got rid of it as soon as I moved in, hauling it down to the curb for the garbage collection. I spent my first night in the house adjusting to the strange creaks and groans of the old structure. Each sound felt foreign, like I was a visitor in someone else's space, but I figured I'd settle in soon enough. The next evening, after work, I stopped by the store to pick up some groceries, planning to make my first proper meal in my new kitchen. When I got back, I noticed something odd. The front door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it on my way out, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I hadn't turned the deadbolt all the way. I went inside, set the bags on the counter, and decided to take a quick tour of the place just to ease my nerves. The living room was empty, the dining room undisturbed, and the bedrooms upstairs were just as I'd left them. Finally, I made my way to the basement door. Now, I'd barely been down to the basement since moving in. It was a dusty, low-ceilinged space with exposed pipes and old, peeling wallpaper. But I figured I should check every corner, so I flicked on the light and made my way down the narrow stairs. The moment I hit the last step, my heart skipped a beat. Sitting dead center in the middle of the basement floor, perfectly positioned as if it had been placed there with care, was the rocking chair. The exact same chair I'd hauled to the curb less than 24 hours ago. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I stared at it, the silence in the basement pressing down on me like a weight. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe one of my neighbors thought it would be funny to bring it back. I considered asking around, but part of me didn't want to invite any strange conversations on my second night in the neighborhood. So I shrugged it off, figuring I'd just take it back to the curb the next day. I made my way back up to the kitchen, hoping to shake off the unsettling sight. I started unpacking my groceries, trying to focus on the mundanity of cooking, but then I heard it. A faint, unmistakable creaking sound, drifting up from the basement. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a light breeze nudging the door on an old porch swing. But it grew louder, more rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was rocking back and forth in that chair. My hands went cold, and I felt my stomach knot. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and, despite every instinct telling me to stay put, I forced myself to head back down those basement stairs. As I rounded the bottom of the stairs and aimed my flashlight toward the middle of the room, I froze. Sitting in the rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth, was an elderly woman. Her hair was thin and white, and she wore a faded pink nightgown that looked so worn it seemed part of her skin. Her eyes were dull, lifeless, fixed on me with a vacant, almost accusing gaze. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, her lips curled into the faintest of frowns. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my ears, and raced back up the stairs. Slamming the basement doors shut behind me, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I didn't know what I would tell them, but I knew I couldn't stay there alone. When they arrived, I was too rattled to explain myself clearly, stumbling over my words as I tried to describe what I'd seen. The officers checked the basement thoroughly, sweeping their flashlights over every corner. But when they came back up, they told me there was no one there. And, of course, the rocking chair was gone. Feeling a bit like I was losing my mind, I reached out to the son of the previous owners. I didn't want to tell him everything, but I described the woman I'd seen, her appearance, her clothing, and he went quiet on the other end of the line. "That sounds like my mother," he said finally, his voice cracking. "That sounds exactly like her. She loved that old chair, wouldn't part with it even after my dad passed. He came over that evening, insisting on taking the rocking chair if I ever saw it again. That night, he walked through the basement with me, calling out to his mother, asking her to rest in peace and to leave me be. We found nothing, of course, and he took a few of his parents' remaining belongings with him, including the chair, though it hadn't reappeared. In the weeks that followed, I kept the basement door locked around the clock. But the uneasiness lingered. Every so often, while cooking or brushing my teeth, I'd catch the faintest whiff of a scent, a mix of lavender and something musty, like old fabric or stale perfume. And late at night, just as I'd drift into sleep, I'd sometimes hear that familiar creak, as if the chair had somehow found its way back and was once again rocking in the dark. It started as a fairly straightforward gig, house-sitting and keeping an eye on an older gentleman who, I'd been told, was dealing with memory issues. It was Keith, an old friend from college, who called me up with the offer. He sounded a bit desperate and eager for someone he could trust to do this favor. "His name's Arthur," he told me over the phone. "My great-uncle. He's been forgetful, you could say. The family can't really take care of him full-time, so we just need someone there for the weekend. Just stay at the house, make sure he doesn't hurt himself or wander off." It sounded simple enough. I had the weekend free, and the pay Keith offered was more than enough for me to drop everything and drive up there. He gave me the address, and by Friday afternoon, I was on my way to Arthur's place, a big, slightly rundown Victorian home in a remote part of upstate New York. The house looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades, and the windows were cloudy, almost grimy, as if the place was slowly being swallowed by time. When I got there, Keith met me at the door, looking a bit more nervous than I expected. He gave me a quick tour of the place, showed me the kitchen, the old-fashioned bathroom with cracked tiles, and the living room with dusty antique furniture. Finally, he pointed to a bedroom at the end of the hallway. "This will be yours for the weekend," he said. Then, with a hesitant glance toward the upstairs staircase, he added, "Arthur usually stays up there. He doesn't come down much, but you might hear him. Just don't be too startled if you hear footsteps at night. He's got a habit of walking around." Keith's tone was oddly guarded. He didn't elaborate, just handed me a set of keys and gave me a pat on the back before heading out. "Good luck," he said, almost under his breath. It was strange, the way he said it, but I shrugged it off, thinking he was just worried about his uncle. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see Arthur, and I wasn't even sure if he knew I was there. I figured he might be in his room, sleeping or just keeping to himself. Around midnight, though, I started hearing sounds, a steady, deliberate thump-thump, like someone pacing back and forth, but the steps were heavy, faster than what I'd expect from an elderly man. I got up, my heart thudding a little in my chest, and peered into the hallway. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, from Arthur's room. But I didn't dare go up there, not that first night. Instead, I went back to bed and convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he just couldn't sleep. Maybe he was lost in some fog of memory, a world that only he could see. The footsteps eventually stopped, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next day, I found myself on edge. I was supposed to check on Arthur, but the idea of going upstairs filled me with a strange, inexplicable dread. Instead, I called out from the bottom of the stairs, saying, "Arthur? Do you need anything?" There was no reply. Just silence, stretching out longer than was comfortable. I was about to turn away when I caught a glimpse of something through the narrow crack of the bedroom door at the top of the stairs. A shadow, just barely visible, like someone was standing there, watching me. I felt a chill slide down my spine, but I told myself I was imagining things. I was in an old house, alone, and I was just getting spooked, right? But that night, it happened again. The footsteps, faster this time, almost frantic. They went on for hours, moving from room to room upstairs, never coming down but always seeming to circle, like someone was lost, or maybe searching for something. I barely slept that night. I kept my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to creak open, half expecting Arthur to stumble in, confused and lost. But nothing happened. I kept listening, the footsteps stopped again, and eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. By the third night, I was exhausted and on edge. Every small sound made me jump, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the dim, amber glow of the old lamps. I was getting ready to turn in, telling myself just one more night, and I'd be done. I was brushing my teeth in the cramped bathroom when I felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and glanced up at the mirror. There, behind me, just barely visible in the reflection, was Arthur. He was standing in the doorway, his face half hidden in shadow, watching me with eyes that seemed strangely sharp, too focused for someone supposedly dealing with memory issues. "Arthur!" I managed to stammer, turning around. But by the time I did, he was gone. I was left staring into the empty hallway, my heart pounding. I didn't hear him walk away. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I went to bed, my nerves stretched thin, sleep a distant hope. It must have been around 3 in the morning when I heard it again, the footsteps, right outside my door this time. They stopped, and then I heard a soft, almost hesitant knock. I didn't answer, too scared to even breathe. And then, as if he sensed I was there, Arthur's voice came through, low and broken. They're watching, you know. They don't like you here. I didn't respond, didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, until the footsteps retreated down the hall. Somehow, I must have fallen asleep after that, though it felt like only moments later that I was jolted awake by a loud crash from somewhere downstairs. Heart racing, I got up and made my way cautiously down the darkened hall. The house felt alive, humming with some energy that I couldn't explain. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Arthur again, this time standing in the doorway to the living room, his back to me, swaying slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. "Arthur?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't react. Instead, he turned his head slowly, just enough for me to see his eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of terror and rage. "They told me you wouldn't listen," he murmured, his voice thin and cracked. "They told me you'd keep watching." And then, he stepped toward me, his movements sudden and jerky, like a puppet on frayed strings. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. He reached out, his hand closing around my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice almost a whisper. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his fingers like iron. "They don't like intruders." In that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I tore myself free, breaking his grip, and bolted up the stairs, slamming myself into the bathroom and locking the door behind me. I heard him outside, his footsteps heavy and relentless, pacing back and forth, his low, muttering voice muffled but relentless. I called Keith in a panic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. To my shock, Keith didn't sound surprised. "Stay in the bathroom," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Just stay there. Try to get some sleep if you can." "Keith, what the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice trembling. But he didn't answer. He just repeated, "Stay in the bathroom," and hung up. I spent the rest of the night huddled in that bathroom, listening to the sounds of Arthur's shuffling steps outside the door, his low muttering filling the silence. At one point I thought I heard him whisper my name, and I clamped my hands over my ears, praying for morning. When dawn finally broke, the house fell silent. I crept out of the bathroom, my legs weak and shaky, and made my way downstairs. Keith was there, waiting for me, his face pale and drawn. He handed me an envelope, more money than he'd promised, and muttered, "I'm sorry. It's complicated." I didn't ask questions. I just took the money, grabbed my things, and left. As I drove away from that house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Arthur's eyes were still on me, following me down the road. To this day, I don't know what was really going on in that house, or what Keith meant when he said it was complicated. All I know is that Arthur wasn't just dealing with memory loss. There was something else in that house, something dark and twisted, something that made my skin crawl just thinking about it. My dad grew up in a small, dreary town in New Hampshire. It was the kind of place where the fog hung low, and the wind always seemed to carry whispers. He'd moved there when he was about 20, looking to get away from the city, from its noise and chaos, and had rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Right next door lived an elderly couple, Henry and Eliza Caldwell. They were quiet folks, mostly keeping to themselves, but were the kind of neighbors who nodded and smiled politely whenever you crossed paths. Henry was in his 70s, tall and bony, with a serious look that matched his deep-set eyes. Eliza, on the other hand, was frail but had a warm, kind demeanor that shone through her wrinkles. It was in the dead of winter, on one of those bone-chilling New England days, that the story began. Snow blanketed the town, piling up against houses and making the streets silent. Dad remembered coming back from the local bar one night, his breath clouding the freezing air as he noticed Henry out on his front steps, looking frazzled. "Have you seen Eliza?" Henry's voice was barely audible above the sharp wind. "She was here, but I can't find her anywhere." Dad shook his head, feeling an odd prickling at the back of his neck. It wasn't like Eliza to wander off, especially not in weather like that. Dad went inside, the conversation lingering in his mind as he tried to shake off a strange unease. The following days passed in a tense, surreal blur. The whole neighborhood was abuzz with quiet murmurs. Henry had asked around, even called the police, but there were no leads. Eliza had simply vanished without a trace. One night, after a game of basketball with some friends, my dad returned home, exhausted but feeling the comforting warmth of his apartment. He just kicked off his shoes when a strange noise drifted to his ears. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft humming, melodic and haunting, coming from the living room. He thought he'd left the radio on, or maybe one of the neighbors was playing music a bit too loud. But as he drew closer, he felt the hair on his arms prick up. It wasn't just any humming. It was an old, familiar tune, one he'd often heard Eliza humming softly to herself on quiet afternoons, sitting on her porch. A chill passed through him as he rounded the corner to the living room, and there she was, sitting on his grandfather's rocking chair. Eliza. Her hair was a mess, falling loosely around her face, her skin a sickly shade of gray. She was staring at the wall, rocking back and forth, whispering in that same haunting melody. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, yet there was an urgency in her voice as she spoke, almost as if she were asking him for something. "It's so cold," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I need warmth." Dad felt his blood run cold. He was frozen in place, unable to move, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to run, to get out of there, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He managed to stammer out her name. "Eliza?" She didn't respond, just continued to rock back and forth, her voice trailing off into silence. It was then that he noticed something strange. Her feet weren't touching the floor. She was hovering just slightly above it, as if she weren't really there. Panic set in, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet as he rushed out of the room. His heart was pounding as he threw open the door and sprinted across the snowy yard to Henry's house, banging on the door until the old man answered, looking dazed and disoriented. "Eliza, she's in my house!" Dad's words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "She's in the living room, sitting on the chair." Henry's face fell, a look of deep sorrow mixed with something else, something almost like guilt. He didn't say a word, just nodded and followed my dad back across the yard. But when they stepped into the living room, the chair was empty. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. "Are you sure?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting her to reappear. Dad could only nod, his mind reeling. He knew what he'd seen. He could still feel her presence, that bone-deep cold that lingered in the room. But Eliza was gone, as if she'd never been there at all. The next day, the police found her body. It was in the basement of her own house, hidden behind a stack of old boxes and broken furniture. She'd been dead for days, likely since the night she'd disappeared. The coroner said she'd suffered a blow to the head, probably from a fall down the basement stairs. It was an accident, they said. She must have gone down there for some reason and slipped. But that didn't explain what my dad had seen. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the mind, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, he knew. He'd seen her, or rather, something of her, lingering in that living room, seeking warmth, seeking solace. The memory haunted him, but it was only after he told me the story that I realized how much it had affected him. He would avoid going into that living room at night, always keeping the lights on, as if fearing that he might see her there again, sitting in that rocking chair, staring off into the distance with those cold, empty eyes. And now, whenever I visit my grandparents' old house, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, something that still lingers in the shadows. It was a hot, restless night in July, the kind where the heat sinks deep into the bones of the city, making it feel more alive, more unsettling. Protests had been sweeping through the country for weeks, each night bringing both powerful messages of unity and sporadic bursts of violence. Our neighborhood had been on edge, split between the families wanting to support the peaceful demonstrations and those afraid of the chaos spilling over. I was 16, old enough to understand what was going on but young enough to feel an uneasy thrill whenever I heard the chants echoing down our block. My parents, who worked long hours at the hospital, had been anxiously following the news, muttering about the good protesters and the ones they called troublemakers. They had different names for each, but their worries felt the same to me, almost palpable. That night, I lay in bed, trying to block out the faint but rhythmic chants that drifted up from the street, occasionally punctuated by car horns or the distant thud of something heavy landing. Around midnight the noise grew closer. I heard my dad curse under his breath, peeking out the window, muttering something about these kids with their masks and flags. He stayed up for a while, watching them pass. Through the narrow slit in my window blinds, I could make out their silhouettes, a group of young people, faces obscured by scarves and bandanas, their signs held high. But they moved through our street without a single raised fist or broken bottle, just marching, calling out their cause into the night. Finally, the commotion faded, and my parents went to bed. I lay there, listening to the deep silence that had settled over the house after so much sound. I wanted to drift off, but a strange sense of restlessness tugged at me. After an hour of twisting in bed, I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water, hoping the cool kitchen tiles might calm my nerves. As I tiptoed down the creaky wooden steps, I noticed something odd. The soft glow of the street lamp outside cast a strange shadow on the wall, darker than usual, sharper. I hesitated, heart pounding, and took another step, eyes locked on the narrow rectangle of light filtering through the living room window. The glass was cracked, just slightly, but it had been carefully taped over to prevent any sound or shards from escaping. My pulse quickened. Who would have done that? And why? The realization hit me like a stone to the gut. Someone had broken the window but took the time to tape it quietly afterward. I backed away, stumbling a bit on the last step as I bolted up to my parents' room. My whispers were frantic, and soon both of them were wide awake. We checked every corner of the house, every room. Nothing was out of place, nothing seemed missing. Still, my mom dialed the police, her voice thick with worry. When the officers arrived, they swept through the house with grim efficiency. After checking the attic, they assured us that no one was hiding and that we were safe. But when they left, the unease lingered, like a bad smell that wouldn't go away. My dad bolted the windows extra tight, and we all went back to bed, though I doubt any of us really slept. It was around 3 a.m. when I jolted awake again, my throat dry and my heart racing. I lay there for a while, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. The house was silent, but not the comforting kind. It was an eerie, expectant kind of silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I don't know what possessed me to go upstairs to the attic. Maybe it was just that prickling feeling, that sense of being watched. Or maybe it was the soft, almost imperceptible sound I heard, a faint shuffle, like something small and light brushing against the attic floorboards. Clutching my phone for a flashlight, I made my way up the narrow staircase to the attic door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the knob. Slowly, carefully, I turned it, wincing at the tiny squeak it made. The attic was pitch black, except for the faint beam from my phone. The air was thick, musty, and I took a cautious step forward, aiming my light across the dusty floor. And then I felt it, a light touch, brushing against my hair, a sensation so soft and unexpected that my whole body froze. A low, raspy chuckle echoed through the cramped space. The laugh was quiet, almost amused, like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around, aiming my flashlight wildly, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. There was nothing there. No figure, no movement, just the stale air and the shadows shifting in the dim light. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping on a pile of old boxes as I fled down the stairs, my breaths coming in panicked gasps. My dad met me halfway down, alarmed by my frantic footsteps. I could barely get the words out, describing the laugh, the touch, the horrible, gut-wrenching certainty that someone, or something, had been there with me. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone, calling the police again. When they arrived this time, they didn't just search the attic, they tore through it, opening every box, moving every piece of dusty furniture. and that's when they found him. An old man, crouched in the shadows, his face hidden beneath a ragged mask, almost like a homemade version of the ones the protesters wore outside. His eyes glinted under the harsh flashlights, his expression both vacant and strangely pleased. He didn't resist when they pulled him out. He barely reacted at all, just stared at us with a look I can only describe as intimate. Like he knew us. As the officers led him downstairs, he spoke in a low, fractured mumble. He'd been watching the protests, he told them, captivated by the unrest, by the dark thrill of it all. He'd seen the looting, the fires, and something in him had clicked. He'd wanted to join, but instead, he'd found his way into our house, creeping in unnoticed amidst the noise and chaos. There, he'd stayed, hiding in the attic, listening to us, watching us. But it was the last thing he said, before they loaded him into the squad car, that chilled me the most. He looked directly at me, a smile tugging at the corners of his cracked lips, and murmured, "Your hair is soft. Like my daughter's used to be." The words hung in the air long after he was gone, and even now, I can still feel his touch, light as a feather, brushing against me in the dark. We moved out of that house not long after, but no matter where I go, no matter how safe I feel, I'll always remember that night. It was 4 years ago on the 4th of July, but I remember it as if it just happened last night. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the distant pop of fireworks, the buzz of people celebrating, it all felt like a scene straight out of some American postcard. But for me, that summer night will always be burned into my memory as something twisted, haunting, and unforgettable. My friend Caleb and I were just starting high school back then. 15, full of dumb ideas, and invincible, or so we thought. Caleb had gotten himself into trouble earlier that summer, and his parents had grounded him over the holiday weekend. But as kids do, his parents weren't strict enough to keep him indoors forever. They wanted him to at least get some fresh air, so they reluctantly let him come with me to the neighborhood barbecue down the street. It was a pretty standard event, neighbors standing around in clusters, making small talk, kids running around with sparklers, the smell of grilled hot dogs and hamburgers filling the air. But Caleb and I couldn't care less. We were bored out of our minds, watching the sky go from bright to dusky, listening to the older kids laughing together by the fire pit. We wanted to be part of it, but we also didn't feel like we really belonged there, either. That's when Caleb leaned over to me, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Let's go visit Avery." Avery Sanders. The girl everyone at school knew and admired. You know the type, gorgeous, smart, effortlessly cool, with parents who were barely ever around. She was a junior at our school, and it was no secret that every guy, including Caleb, had a massive crush on her. "You think she's home?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Who knows?" Caleb shrugged, already heading down the street. "Only one way to find out." I followed him reluctantly. As we walked, Caleb filled the silence with jokes and nervous laughter, egging me on about how Avery was probably waiting for us, probably wondering where we were. We planned on doing nothing more than knocking on her door and sprinting off before she answered. A classic prank that we thought was hilarious back then. The Sanders house was just a few blocks away. It was one of those modern, minimalistic places with large windows and neat landscaping. Their driveway was empty, and there were no lights on inside. I remember the place looked unusually quiet, even eerie, but we figured it was because her parents were out of town. Caleb shot me a grin, and we walked up to the door. As we approached, I felt an uncomfortable tug in my gut, like something was off. But Caleb was already reaching for the door, turning the handle, and to my surprise it swung open. "What the hell, man?" I hissed. "We're not actually going inside, are we?" "Come on, it's Avery's house," Caleb whispered back, his grin widening. "Besides, the door's unlocked. Let's just take a quick look." Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The place was as dark and silent as it looked from the outside. The only light came from the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the big windows. It felt strangely deserted, like no one had been there in days. We crept through the entryway, trying to keep our footsteps light, even though we were both fighting the urge to laugh. "Hello?" Caleb whispered, half joking. There was no response. We tiptoed further in, peeking around corners and into rooms, the thrill of being somewhere we shouldn't be making us feel braver than we had any right to be. Avery's house was neat, almost too neat, as if it had been staged for a photo shoot but hadn't been lived in. The air felt stale, thick with a weird smell I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was just my nerves, but every creak and shadow seemed to grow darker, heavier, more foreboding. "Let's check out upstairs," Caleb whispered, pointing to the staircase at the end of the hall. The thought of wandering deeper into this house should have made me back out right then. But we were already too far in. So, with Caleb leading the way, we climbed the stairs, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. When we reached the second floor, we made our way to what I assumed was Avery's bedroom. The door was ajar, revealing a room that was immaculately clean, almost like a showpiece. Posters lined the walls, clothes neatly folded on a chair, a few photos on her desk. Caleb took a look around, probably picturing some imaginary scenario where he'd finally confess his feelings to her. Then, suddenly, he stopped, his face turning pale as he stared at something in the corner of the room. "What?" I whispered, my own voice barely audible. He didn't respond, just pointed to the closet. I took a step closer, squinting in the dim light. There, through the crack in the closet door, I saw it, the outline of a figure, hunched down, barely visible. It was someone hiding, staring out at us. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I grabbed Caleb's arm. "What the hell, Caleb?" I hissed. "There's someone in there!" Caleb's eyes were wide, his face pale as he pulled me back towards the door. We had barely made it 2 steps when we heard a loud, heavy thud from downstairs. It echoed through the silence, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps heading up the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I thought it would give us away. "Hide!" I whispered, dragging Caleb into the nearest room, the bathroom. I closed the door as quietly as I could, pressing my ear to the wood. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the creak of the floorboards betraying every step. Then came the sound of heavy, ragged breathing, right outside the bathroom door. I clamped my hand over my mouth, praying, begging whoever was out there wouldn't hear us. The footsteps stopped right in front of us, and I could see Caleb's terrified reflection in the bathroom mirror. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door, then another, each one harder and angrier than the last. Whoever was out there started shouting, a low, guttural voice filled with rage, demanding that we come out. In that moment, something in me snapped. I grabbed a wrench from the sink, I still don't know why it was there, and swung it at the bathroom window, shattering the glass. Without thinking, I climbed out, my hands and legs getting scratched as I tumbled onto the grass below. Caleb followed right after, both of us stumbling and gasping for breath as we sprinted away from the house, not daring to look back. We didn't stop running until we were back at the barbecue, our hands bleeding, our hearts racing. No one seemed to notice we were gone, let alone the state we were in. But I could barely hear anything over the pounding in my ears, the memory of that figure in the closet and the voice of the man pounding on the door haunting me. We never spoke about it again, at least not until a few days later when I finally broke down and went to the police. I felt guilty, like I had to tell someone. But when they followed up with the Sanders, Avery's dad assured them that they hadn't had any guests or hired anyone to house sit. I was only 12 when my family moved to an old farmhouse in rural Louisiana. My dad, always drawn to the countryside, had been dreaming of starting a new life away from the bustling city. For him, the charm of open fields, misty mornings, and the silence of the rural night seemed like heaven. But for me, the only thing that made the move bearable was that my dog, Tucker, would be coming along. He was a big, loyal Labrador with a streak of curiosity, and I knew he'd be by my side no matter what. The house was nothing special at first glance. It had been vacant for years, and the faint smell of dust and mildew lingered even after hours of airing it out. The previous owners had left it in a decent state, but I still felt the weight of its age pressing down on me every time I looked at its warped wooden walls. There was an eerie sense that the house had memories of its own, a presence that was almost tangible when the sun went down. On the second night, everything was quiet until well after midnight. I was lying in bed, fighting to keep my eyes shut against the unfamiliar creaks and groans echoing down the narrow hall outside my room. Tucker lay curled up on the floor beside me, his steady breathing a comfort in the darkness. But suddenly, his ears perked up, and he lifted his head, staring intently toward the far corner of the room. Tucker's low growl rumbled through the silence, sending a chill down my spine. I strained my eyes, trying to see what had caught his attention, but there was nothing, just shadows. Still, Tucker's growling turned into an angry bark, his body tense and alert as he watched the empty corner as if something invisible was taunting him. I sat up, whispering his name, trying to calm him, but his focus never wavered. He kept barking, his hackles raised, for a good few minutes before he finally settled down. I lay back in bed, feeling far from safe, and convinced myself it was just the newness of the house unsettling him. The following morning, a knock on the door startled my dad and me as we were having breakfast. He went to answer it, and standing on the other side was an elderly man, maybe in his 70s, with sun-leathered skin and piercing blue eyes that seemed to drill into you when he looked your way. He introduced himself as Leon, our neighbor from down the road. Dad seemed eager to make friends, but something about Leon unsettled me. He had this strange, too friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Leon chatted with Dad for a while, mostly about how he'd lived in the area his whole life and remembered the days when the farmland around us was more alive with crops and cattle. Then he turned his attention to me, his smile widening just a little too much. "You must be Jesse," he said, his voice a strange blend of cheerfulness and something I couldn't place. "Heard you're new around here. I bet you and your dog will love it here. So much space to run around, so many adventures to be had." He didn't seem to want to leave. He kept making small talk, and his gaze lingered a little too long on me, making me feel like a bug under a magnifying glass. Finally, he said his goodbyes and shuffled off, but I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling he'd left behind. Later that afternoon, I was outside tossing a tennis ball for Tucker when Leon reappeared out of nowhere, as if he'd been watching us the whole time. He sauntered over, not saying a word at first, just stood beside me and watched as I threw the ball. Then, out of the blue, he started mimicking the sound of Pikachu, the Pokemon character. Pikachu, he said in this high, eerie voice that was almost childlike. At first I laughed, assuming he was just being goofy. But then he kept going, his voice getting stranger, and his gaze was fixed on me in a way that made my stomach churn. I could feel a tension in the air that wasn't there before, and suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to go back inside. Just then, my dad came out, noticing how uncomfortable I looked. He gave Leon a polite but firm nod and suggested he should probably head home. Leon didn't argue. He just smiled, gave me one last lingering look, and shuffled off down the road without a word. That night, I found it hard to sleep. I kept thinking about Leon, about the way he'd stared at me, about that weird Pikachu voice that seemed to echo in my mind even now. Tucker lay beside me as usual, but this time, he was restless too, lifting his head and huffing at the darkness as if he could sense my unease. Around 3 in the morning, Tucker woke me up with his barking again. This time, he was at the window, paws up on the sill, barking furiously at something outside. I got up, heart pounding, and peered through the curtains, but all I could see was the pale moonlight spilling across the empty fields. I was about to step back when I heard it. Pikachu! The voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was Leon's voice, coming from somewhere out there in the dark, just beyond the window. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, choking down a scream. I raced out of my room and called for my dad, who burst out of his room, bleary-eyed but instantly alert when he saw the fear on my face. I stammered out what I'd heard, and without a word, he grabbed a flashlight and stormed outside, Tucker barking wildly at his heels. I waited by the door, every nerve on edge, as he swept the light across the yard, calling Leon's name. But there was no answer. He even went down the road to check if Leon was anywhere nearby, but the old man was nowhere to be found. The next day, Dad went to the house Leon had pointed to as his own when we'd first met him. It was a small, rundown place, but when he knocked on the door, a frail woman answered, her face lined with age but her eyes bright and alert. When Dad asked if Leon was home, she looked at him in confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head slowly, "but there's no one named Leon here. I've lived here alone since my husband passed 5 years ago. I don't know anyone named Leon." My dad stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of it. He described Leon, his age, his clothes, the strange, unsettling smile. The woman's face grew pale as she listened, and finally she whispered, "I think you might have seen the man who used to live down that road, but he passed away over 10 years ago. He was known for wandering around, watching people, and talking to the kids who played near the fields." When my dad told me what she'd said, I felt a sickening chill crawl over me. That night, we locked all the doors and windows, and Dad sat up all night in the living room, keeping watch. For days, I refused to go outside alone, and Tucker, ever watchful, stayed close by my side, his eyes never straying far from the edges of the yard. We never saw or heard from Leon again. But sometimes, when I lie in bed, I swear I can still hear his voice drifting through the night, that high-pitched, childlike whisper calling out in the dark. "Pika! Pikachu!" So, this happened when I was 17, working at a summer camp out in the woods of Michigan. I guess it was supposed to be the classic coming-of-age summer, making friends, doing stupid things under the stars, trying to look cool in front of the kids we were supposed to be mentoring. But it didn't end up like that. Not for me, at least. My shift was mostly night hours, helping keep things safe once everyone was supposed to be asleep. We had these log cabins spread all over, a main building with the office and some meeting rooms, and then, of course, acres of dense, dark forest pressing in from every side. No real cell service out there either. It was easy to feel isolated, which I thought was kind of fun at first, you know? But that first night made me realize there was something about that place that just didn't sit right. It all started on a night when 3 other camp counselors and I decided to sneak off and smoke in the woods. We'd found a hidden spot far from any camp trails. Jay, Callie, and Felix, the 3 others with me, were whispering and laughing, thinking we were safe from the eyes of our boss, Frank, who'd been a bit of a hard ass since day one. The night was heavy with that thick, piney smell, and every sound echoed strangely out there, bouncing around the trees and blending into the dark. I'd just taken a drag when we all heard it, a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. We froze, looking at each other. At first, Jay just laughed it off, said it was probably some animal. But then, about 10 feet away, a bright flash snapped through the trees. My stomach dropped. It looked like a camera flash. We were positive we'd been caught. I could practically picture Frank hiding there, just out of sight, holding up a camera and getting proof to bust us. Felix muttered something about heading back. He was the type who wanted to keep his record squeaky clean. Callie, though, whispered we should just stay quiet, but honestly, I was already on edge. The thought of losing the job didn't even scare me at that point. It was more the feeling of being watched. Something wasn't right. So, I said I was going back to the main office to, well, I don't even know. Confess? Maybe I just wanted an excuse to get out of those woods. Either way, I left them behind and started making my way through the trees. But as soon as I stepped out of the tree line and the camp buildings came into view, a sense of dread washed over me, and it wasn't just the idea of getting caught. There was something about that night, the stillness, the dark windows of the cabins, that felt different. Wrong, almost. When I reached the office building, I hesitated. The front door was open, just a crack, like someone had left it that way, waiting for me. The light inside was dim, flickering faintly. My pulse quickened, but I pushed the door open anyway, calling out a cautious, "Hello?" No answer, just the sound of the door clicking shut behind me, louder than it should have been in that empty hall. Then, from down the hallway, I heard the faintest shuffling sound, like someone moving, but trying to stay hidden. I held my breath, not moving, straining to hear. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the shadows at the end of the hall, a figure, maybe, just a glimpse of it, before it vanished around the corner. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat break out on my back, and backed out the door as quickly as I could, not daring to turn around. When I got back to the cabin, Johnny, the guy I shared the room with, was still up, reading under a dim lamp. I tried to act casual, but he must have seen my face. "What's up with you?" he asked, setting his book down. I spilled everything, the flash, the weird sounds, seeing someone in the main office. But he just laughed, told me I was probably paranoid from the woods or the smoke. I didn't blame him. It sounded crazy when I said it out loud. But I was too on edge to sleep alone, so I begged him to let me crash on his side of the room. Eventually, he relented, and I tried to fall asleep, my heart still racing. Sometime in the night, I heard a faint knock on the window. I thought I was dreaming at first, but there it was again. A soft, insistent tapping. I rolled over, telling myself it was a branch or something, just the wind, but when I finally mustered the courage to look, I felt every hair on my neck stand up. Outside the window, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. They were standing close, one hand raised as if they were waving. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of their body. I stared at them, paralyzed, until they slowly lowered their hand, and then they were gone, fading back into the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light finally broke, I practically dragged Johnny to the camp office to tell Frank, convinced he'd believe me now. But Frank just shrugged it off, said we probably freaked ourselves out over nothing. I could tell he thought I was wasting his time, and he barely listened before dismissing us both. The last day of camp, I felt like I was finally in the clear. I hadn't seen anything since that night, no weird noises, no flashes. But when I got back to my cabin after lunch, my heart nearly stopped. Taped to my window were 4 photos. The first one showed me in the woods with Jay, Callie, and Felix, clear as day, even though I hadn't seen anyone around that night. The second was of me, asleep in my bed. My mouth went dry as I looked at it, thinking of all those nights I'd forced myself to sleep with my back turned to the window, unaware that someone had been watching, and worse, taking pictures. The third was from the main office. It was a photo of me standing in the doorway, my face pale and eyes wide with fear. And then, the last picture, a close-up of my car's license plate. It was the spring of 2020, during the peak of the COVID-19 lockdowns. My family and I had made the decision to leave our small apartment in the city to spend the quarantine in our lake house in Massachusetts. We'd had the place for years but barely spent much time there aside from summer weekends. Now, though, it felt like the perfect escape, a secluded house by the lake, surrounded by nothing but thick trees and silence. One evening, after a quiet day of reading, cooking, and relaxing, my younger brothers, Leo and Jamie, suggested we play beer pong out on the back deck. I remember it was unusually warm for spring, the air dense and muddy. We could hear the faint sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was nice, a break from the constant news about the pandemic and the eeriness of empty city streets. We were a few games in, laughing at Leo's lousy aim, when Jamie suddenly froze. He was standing closest to the sliding door that led into the house, his head cocked to one side as if he were listening. I brushed it off, thinking he was playing around, but then he turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, faintly, I caught it too, a creak, like the sound of footsteps moving slowly across the floorboards inside the house. It was subtle but distinct, enough to set my nerves on edge. My dad, who had been watching us from his chair on the porch, noticed our unease. "What's going on?" he asked. "Dad, I think someone's in the house," Jamie whispered, glancing nervously at the door. We all stood frozen for a moment. staring through the glass into the darkened house. My dad and I eventually decided to go check it out. We stepped inside quietly, careful not to make a sound. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp near the driveway that cast a dull yellow glow through the front windows. "Hello?" my dad called out softly. Silence. We moved slowly through each room, checking behind doors and peeking into closets. Nothing. After a thorough search, we convinced ourselves that maybe it had just been the house settling or an animal under the porch. We locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went back outside, laughing it off. But our laughter was cut short. Just as we were settling back onto the porch, there was a loud, frantic knocking at the glass sliding door. The sound was sharp, panicked, a fist pounding on the glass. We all jumped, turning toward the door, and there, silhouetted in the faint light, was a man. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wide and wild. "Please, let me in! I need help!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the glass but desperate. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if something, or someone, was after him. My dad, ever the cautious type, approached the door slowly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but wary. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept pounding on the door, his eyes darting from us to the dark woods beyond the house. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help," he said again. "Where are you hurt?" my dad asked. But the man didn't answer directly. He just kept pleading, his hands leaving smudges on the glass. Something felt wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that creeping unease. "If you don't leave, I'm calling the police," my dad said firmly, his hand hovering over his phone. The man stopped, his face twisting into a mix of anger and despair. But then, without another word, he stepped back into the shadows, vanishing into the darkness beyond the deck. We all stood there for a moment, stunned, the adrenaline coursing through us. My dad closed the curtains and locked the door, instructing us to make sure all the windows and doors were locked. That night, we went to bed on edge, the eerie encounter replaying in my mind. Just as I was beginning to drift off, a sudden crash jolted me awake. The unmistakable sound of breaking glass echoed through the house. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, dialing my dad's number in a panic. "Dad, did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Stay in your room. Lock the door and hide," he instructed. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "I'll be right there." I slid into my closet, my breathing shallow, and crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, moving through the house. They were slow, unhurried, as if whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, any clue as to what was happening. Then, to my horror, the door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. Through the slats of the closet door, I could see him, a shadowed figure, standing in the middle of my room. He was tall, his face obscured in the dim light, but I could see his eyes, bright and intent, scanning the room. My heart pounded as he took a step closer to the closet, his gaze settling on the door. "I know you're in there," he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay hidden. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and threw open the closet door, bolting past him before he could react. I ran down the hallway, my feet barely touching the floor as I sprinted to my parents' room. My dad flung open the door, pulling me inside and locking it behind us. We huddled together, listening as the footsteps faded, then disappeared entirely. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house, but the man was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence he'd ever been there at all, save for the shattered glass and the smudges on the sliding door. They helped us cover the broken window with garbage bags, promising to send someone by to check in on us. But that night, as I lay awake in bed, every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, each sound a reminder of the man who'd found his way into our lives, leaving us with nothing but questions and a lingering, bone-deep fear that he might return. It was only a few weeks after moving out of my parents' house on Staten Island and settling into a tiny apartment in Manhattan. The thrill of being on my own was exhilarating. Manhattan was where everything happened, or so I thought. But living on my own wasn't cheap. So, like most people fresh out of their parents' place, I was trying to furnish my space on a tight budget. I'd been scrolling through apps like Letgo and Craigslist, hoping to score some decent furniture without breaking the bank. One night, just as I was about to give up for the day, I saw a listing pop up for a cabinet. It was simple but beautiful, with an old, vintage look that would add some character to my space. The best part? It was only $30, which was unbelievably cheap for anything in the city. I immediately messaged the seller, a guy named Caleb, to see if it was still available. He replied right away, saying it was. The conversation was short and to the point. Caleb mentioned that he was moving out of town and was desperate to get rid of the last few items before he left. He seemed almost too eager to set up a time and place to meet, but I didn't think much of it. I told him I could come by the next day after work. That's when he said he was only free late at night. Like really late. He proposed we meet at 10:30 p.m., and I paused for a moment. Meeting a stranger that late wasn't ideal, especially in an unfamiliar area, but I really wanted that cabinet. So, reluctantly, I agreed. He texted me an address near an old park on the lower end of Manhattan. It was a dead-end street that I wasn't familiar with, and when I looked it up, it didn't seem to be a residential area. But it was too late to back out. I figured I could handle myself. I'd just pick up the cabinet quickly and leave. The night of the meetup, I took the subway and got off a couple of blocks away from the location. As I walked, the mist from the river seemed to settle around the area, thickening with every step. I remember checking my phone. It was 10:15 p.m., and I was a little early. Just as I arrived at the street, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Caleb. "You're early." That made me pause. How could he know I was already there? The fog was so dense that I could barely see past the first few feet in front of me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just guessing. Maybe he figured most people arrive a bit before the meeting time. Still, there was an unsettling feeling in my gut that told me something wasn't quite right. Trying to ignore it, I sent a quick reply. "Yep, just got here. Where's the cabinet?" After a few moments, another message came through. "Come down the path between the two buildings. I'm in the backyard with it." I hesitated, glancing around. The path he mentioned was just a narrow alleyway between two tall, decrepit buildings, with barely any light reaching it. My instincts told me to turn back, but the curiosity got the best of me. I took a deep breath and stepped into the alley. The fog seemed to thicken as I walked further, dampening all the usual sounds of the city. After a few steps, I noticed something odd, a faint smell, musty and metallic, like old, wet iron. It hung in the air, and each step made it more intense. I tried to calm myself by thinking about how the cabinet would look in my apartment, but the unease lingered, like a shadow. Finally, I emerged into a small, enclosed backyard. My phone buzzed again. It was another text from Caleb. "Just come inside. The door's open. Cabinets by the window." The backyard itself was littered with old junk, rusted bikes, cracked flower pots, random scraps of metal. No cabinet. I peered up at the building's dark windows, each one looking more abandoned than the last. It dawned on me that this whole place was likely abandoned. The thought sent a chill down my spine. The door to the back of the building was slightly ajar, and I felt that familiar pull of unease urging me to leave. But just as I turned to go, something caught my eye. Figures. People. Standing along the far side of the yard, pressed up against the wall. There were 3 of them, shadowy and still, barely visible in the fog. I squinted, trying to make out their features, but the fog was too thick. I could only tell that they were tall, wearing dark clothing, and watching me. Panic started to well up. I glanced down at my phone, about to text Caleb to ask if he was one of them, but before I could type a word, one of them moved. Then, without warning, all 3 figures started walking toward me, slowly at first, then quicker, as if they'd been given some silent signal to advance. My heart pounded as I spun around, sprinting back down the alley. I didn't dare look back. I could hear footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My breathing was ragged, my heart racing as I barreled back down the street. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I kept running until I saw a group of people outside a bar, the neon lights casting a warm, reassuring glow on the sidewalk. Gasping for breath, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, explaining everything as quickly and clearly as I could. It didn't take long for the police to show up. I was still shaken, trying to explain to the officers what had happened, how Caleb had led me to that backyard with the promise of a cabinet. They took my statement, nodded in all the right places, and promised they'd check out the area. When they returned, though, their expressions had changed. The officer in charge told me that the two buildings, the ones Caleb had supposedly been using, were both vacant and had been for years. They said there was no one there, and most disturbing of all, they couldn't find any cabinet, or any signs of the figures I'd seen. I pulled out my phone, showing them the text from Caleb, proof that he'd lured me there. But as I scrolled, my stomach dropped. The messages were gone. Every single one vanished as if they'd never been there. I tried to remember the details, to convince them, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They chalked it up to a mistake, maybe someone playing a prank, and I was left standing on that foggy street, feeling like I'd just escaped something far darker than a prank. The weeks that followed were full of sleepless nights and paranoia. I never got any more information about Caleb, no closure, and to this day, I wonder what might have happened if I'd taken another step forward into that building. I was maybe 9 years old the first time my family started spending time at my uncle's cabin. Nestled deep in the forests of Kentucky, it was this old, creaking log house with walls that seemed to sigh and a roof that struggled to keep out the rain. Uncle Joe wasn't exactly the woodsman type, but he loved that place and swore that it had some kind of healing powers. My parents called it our weekend getaway, but to me, it always felt more like a punishment. See, the thing about Uncle Joe's cabin was that it was isolated, really isolated. There were no neighbors for miles. It was the sort of place where, once the sun dipped below the tree line, you could barely see your own hand in front of your face without a flashlight. Cell reception was a joke, and Uncle Joe, being old-fashioned, insisted on relying on a rusty old landline that worked maybe half the time. My dad loved it. I think he secretly enjoyed seeing me squirm when we'd lose power during storms and I'd be stuck in the pitch-black cabin, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Mom would laugh and say I was just being a city kid. But there was one visit that left a scar on me. A memory I can never shake, no matter how many years have passed. It was late October. The leaves were in full fiery bloom, the air crisp with that kind of stillness that felt almost like it was waiting for something. We arrived early in the morning, and I spent the day outside, kicking through leaves and letting the autumn sun keep me warm. Around mid-afternoon, I asked my mom if I could go for a little walk by myself. She looked at my dad, who shrugged and said, "As long as you don't go too far." I promised I wouldn't. And I didn't at first. But the forest has this way of pulling you in, almost like it has its own voice. I wandered farther than I'd planned, just following the sounds of birds and the rustling of branches. I wasn't scared, at least not at first. But then, as I started to turn back, I felt something. Like a weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but a sense. A feeling deep in my gut that someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off. I was 9. For crying out loud, scaring myself was practically a hobby. But this was different. This was intense. My heart started pounding, my palms getting slick with sweat despite the cool air. I picked up my pace, practically power walking through the trees, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. And then I saw it, a shadow. A shape, just a few dozen feet behind me, moving through the trees. I broke into a run. By the time I reached the cabin, I was a sweaty, breathless mess. My mom looked at me, concern flickering across her face, but I just mumbled something about getting tired and rushed inside. I felt safe again once I was inside, surrounded by familiar things, the smell of old wood, the ticking of Uncle Joe's ancient clock, the sound of my dad's laugh echoing from the other room. Later that evening, my parents and Uncle Joe decided to go into town to pick up some supplies. I begged to stay behind. After all, it was nearly dark, and the thought of going back into those woods made my stomach churn. My mom, sensing my unease, promised they wouldn't be gone long. "Just an hour, maybe 2, she said, tousling my hair before they left. I watched from the window as their car disappeared down the long, winding driveway. The forest around the cabin was already shrouded in shadow, the trees looking like tall, silent sentinels. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the static from the poor reception just made the room feel more empty. Then came the knock. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. 3 steady knocks, like someone tapping their fingers on the door in a slow, almost mocking way. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. I knew they were gone. I crept toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear my parents' familiar voices. But instead, a voice I didn't recognize called out, low and scratchy. "Hey, kid! I need some help. Can you let me in?" Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep that door shut. But the voice, there was something so wrong about it. It sounded strained, like whoever was out there was trying to sound friendly but didn't really know how. Like they were imitating what a friendly person should sound like. "I can't," I stammered, hoping he'd just go away. There was a pause. Then he spoke again, his tone a bit sharper this time. "It's getting cold out here, kid. Just let me in for a minute, alright? I just need to use the phone." Panic flared in my chest. My mind raced with excuses. My dad is here. He'll be back any second," I bluffed, trying to make my voice sound steadier than I felt. Another pause, longer this time. Then, the voice said something that made my blood turn to ice. "I saw him leave, kid. Saw him and your mom drive off, just a few minutes ago. You're all alone, aren't you?" I stumbled back from the door, my heart hammering as I realized he'd been watching us. Watching me. Suddenly, the knocks turned into pounding. Heavy, angry blows that rattled the door in its frame. I could hear him grunting, muttering under his breath as he tried to force his way inside. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, my body frozen with fear. Then I remembered something. Uncle Joe kept a hunting rifle in his room. I sprinted down the hall, throwing myself into the dark bedroom and slamming the door behind me. I grabbed the rifle from the closet, struggling to steady my hands as I loaded it just like Uncle Joe had shown me that summer. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but somehow, I managed to get it ready. The pounding had stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. I could feel him out there, just on the other side of the bedroom door. And then, as if on cue, he spoke again, his voice so close it felt like he was standing right next to me. "Kid, if you don't let me in, things are gonna get real bad for you." I raised the rifle, aiming it at the door with my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel my finger on the trigger, sweat dripping down my brow. Seconds dragged by like hours, and then, slowly, the handle began to turn. I barely had time to think. As the door creaked open and I saw a face, a pale, grinning face peering through the crack, I screamed and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening, the recoil slamming into my shoulder as the man staggered back, a look of shock replacing his grin. He stumbled into the hallway, holding up his hands in surrender, his friend close behind. I kept the rifle aimed at them, my whole body trembling as I watched them back away, down the hall, out the door, and into the dark forest. When my parents finally got home, I was still sitting in Uncle Joe's room, the rifle clutched in my hands, staring at the doorway. They called the police, and a search was organized, but they never found the men. A few footprints, some disturbed earth near the trees, that was it. They just disappeared into the night, like shadows. After that, Uncle Joe installed a heavy-duty lock on the front door and put up a few security cameras around the property. But it didn't matter. I never went back to that cabin again. It was the summer of 1995. I was 6 or maybe 7 years old, and my parents had signed me up for a summer day camp. It was one of those things that met at the local community center, with activities to keep us busy and out of trouble while our parents were at work. I didn't know anyone when I started, but kids make friends quickly, and soon enough, I had a small circle. We'd spend the days making crafts, playing soccer, and running around the dusty playground that always seemed just a little too hot. One day, I was kicking rocks at the edge of the playground, close to the fence that separated us from the road. My friends were elsewhere, and I was just lost in my own little world when I noticed him, a man sitting alone on a bench right by the fence. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe older, with thinning gray hair and a face that was leathery and tan from too many hours in the sun. He had on an old, faded flannel shirt even though it was hot out, and there was something about him that made me uneasy, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Then he looked at me, and he smiled. Not the kind of warm, friendly smile you might expect from a grandfatherly figure. No, this was something else, something that felt off. "Hey there, kiddo," he called out, his voice rough like gravel. "You look like you're having a great time." I froze. My parents had taught me about strangers, but there was also this strange pressure not to be rude to adults. I mumbled something, maybe a shy "hi," and glanced away, hoping he'd leave me alone. But he didn't. "You know, I'm a friend of your mom's," he continued, his voice low. "She told me she'd be a little late picking you up today. Figured I'd come and wait for you." That made me stop. He knew my mom? I looked up at him, and he was watching me with this kind of intensity that made me feel like a bug under a magnifying glass. Something felt wrong, but I was too young to figure out what. "What's your name?" he asked, tilting his head in a way that reminded me of a hawk watching a mouse. "Thomas," I said, almost by reflex. Part of me wanted to turn and run back to the other kids, but there was something about the way he looked at me that held me in place. "Good to meet you, Thomas. You can call me Mr. Robbie," he said, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, "You know, I promised your mom I'd take you out for some ice cream after camp today. Sound good?" Something felt wrong. The way he said it didn't sit right with me. Still, he knew my mom's name. That was proof enough for 6-year-old me that he must be telling the truth. Besides, who would lie about something like that? A few minutes later, the camp counselor, Ms. Evelyn, blew her whistle, signaling the end of the day. As I turned to head back to the group, I felt Mr. Robbie's hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a little too firm for my liking. "I'll be right here," he murmured, almost as if he was reminding me not to forget him. I nodded, feeling a growing sense of unease. When Ms. Evelyn called my name, I started toward her, but Mr. Robbie was there too, walking right up to her, a wide, too smooth smile on his face. "I'm here to pick up Thomas," he said, his voice confident, as though he'd done this 100 times before. Ms. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Are you Thomas's father?" she asked, her tone wary. "Oh, no," he chuckled. "I'm just a good family friend. Thomas knows me, don't you, bud?" I looked up at him, and for a second, I almost said something. But then I remembered what he'd said about knowing my mom. He was a friend of hers, right? And she wouldn't want me to be rude. So I nodded. Ms. Evelyn hesitated for a long moment, then looked at me. "Do you know this man?" she asked. Again I nodded. She seemed to relax, and I felt a pang of guilt for not telling her that something about Mr. Robbie felt wrong. But then she patted my shoulder and said, "Okay, Thomas. You be safe. See you tomorrow." Mr. Robbie's hand was on my shoulder again, firmer this time. "Come on, kiddo. Let's go get that ice cream." The parking lot was mostly empty by then, and his car was parked far off in a corner, away from the other cars. It was an old, beat-up blue sedan, with rust crawling up the sides and a crack running along the windshield. He opened the back door for me, practically nudging me inside, and as soon as I was in, he slammed it shut and locked it. I remember looking around and feeling a rising panic. This wasn't right. I was supposed to sit in the front seat, right? That's what my parents always did. But Mr. Robbie got in the front, started the engine, and before I could say anything, he peeled out of the parking lot, driving fast. "Sit down, kid," he barked when I tried to look back out the window. "Don't make this difficult." His voice was sharp, cutting, and all the friendliness was gone from his face. I shrank back, pressing myself into the seat, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was really, really wrong, and I was too scared to even think. As we sped down the street, I saw a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. Ms. Evelyn was there, at the edge of the parking lot, her face twisted in horror, pointing at the car. I think she was shouting, but I couldn't hear anything over the roar of the engine. Then, like a miracle, I heard the sound of sirens. They were faint at first, then growing louder, closing in on us. Mr. Robbie swore under his breath, his hands tightening on the wheel as he sped up. But the sirens grew louder, closer, until finally he had no choice but to pull over. 2 police officers approached the car, one tapping on the driver's window with a stern expression. "Step out of the car, sir," he ordered. Mr. Robbie opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the officer yanked the door open, pulling him out. The second officer came around to my door, opening it carefully, and reaching a hand out to me. "Are you okay, son?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, too stunned to speak. The police took Mr. Robbie away in handcuffs, and a few minutes later, my mom arrived, her face pale and her eyes red with worry. She hugged me so tightly I thought I'd break, but I didn't mind. I was just glad to be with her, to be safe. Later, she told me that Ms. Evelyn had realized something was wrong almost immediately after we left. She'd called the camp director, who called my mom, and together they'd followed Mr. Robbie's car until they saw the police and flagged them down. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't. But sometimes, late at night, I imagine it. And that's why, to this day, I don't like going near playgrounds or hearing sirens. The memories come rushing back, and all I can think of is that sickening smile, those rough hands, and the terrible, unshakable feeling that I might never have made it home. One evening, after a long day at the office, I found myself working far later than usual. The night was dark, dense clouds smothered the stars, and a thin layer of fog crept across the asphalt. I was tired, a bit on edge, and mostly just ready to get home. As I drove, my gas light blinked on, a cruel twist in an already exhausting night. I groaned. The only gas station nearby had a reputation, and not the kind you'd feel safe ignoring. There was a place a bit farther down the road, a cozy, well-lit gas station, but it was closed at this hour. So, I turned onto a side road and headed to the closest open station, the one I generally avoided at night. A couple of my coworkers had warned me about it, a gathering spot for the homeless and drug users after dark. I tried to rationalize the risk, reassuring myself it would only take a few minutes to fill the tank and be on my way. The station was dimly lit. A single flickering fluorescent light above the pump cast an eerie glow over the lot. I saw an old van parked in one corner, and my stomach churned at the sight of a few scattered figures in the shadows. Most kept their distance, but one man caught my eye. He was tall, painfully thin, dressed in layers of ragged, mismatched clothing, and he had a large, lumpy bag clutched in one hand. He was bent over a trash can, rummaging through the garbage with a kind of grim determination. I pulled up to the pump, keeping my eyes on him as I parked. I was trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest, but something about him made me uneasy. He seemed to sense my gaze because, suddenly, he stopped digging through the trash and lifted his head. Our eyes met, and his face twisted into a strange, unsettling smile. His gaze was sharp, too focused for someone who seemed so lost in his own world just moments ago. I hesitated, hand poised on the door handle, wondering if it was worth it. Maybe I should just get back in the car, find another station, even if it was a longer drive. But then he spoke. "Funny thing about bags, you know?" His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "You can fit a lot in a bag like this." I didn't respond, hoping he would lose interest. But he kept talking, louder this time, as if trying to reel me in. "Sometimes you could even fit a body in here," he said, shaking the bag a little, as if to illustrate his point. "And they won't catch you for it, you know? They never do." I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could barely process what he was saying. His words didn't feel real, like some twisted fragment of a nightmare. I wanted to believe he was just rambling, saying whatever he could to scare me. But the look in his eyes was too focused, too intent. I felt like a rabbit staring into the eyes of a predator. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. I unlocked the gas cap, keeping my head down and pretending not to hear him. If I just filled up quickly, I could be gone in minutes. I'd be safe. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his head cocked to the side like he was studying an insect. Then, to my horror, he started walking towards me, dragging the bag behind him. I noticed for the first time he was holding a child's bike in his other hand, the small wheels squeaking as they dragged across the ground. The absurdity of it, combined with his menacing stare, made me want to scream. "Where you going? Don't you want to know what's in the bag?" he asked, his voice low and coaxing, like he was talking to a frightened animal. I forced myself to keep breathing, counting down the seconds in my head as I filled up the tank. I tried to ignore the pounding in my ears, the raw fear clawing at my insides. I could feel his gaze, like a tangible weight pressing down on me. I needed to get out. Now. As I moved to replace the gas nozzle, I saw another figure lurking behind one of the pumps, partially obscured by the shadows. It was a man wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a mask that hid his mouth. He stood still, too still, like he was waiting for something. Panic surged through me, raw and visceral. I was trapped between two strangers, one muttering about bodies and bags, and the other hiding in the darkness. It felt like a scene ripped from a horror movie, and all I could think was, I need to get back in the car. I turned my back on the man with the bag, praying he wouldn't come any closer. My hands shook as I opened my car door, trying to move as casually as possible, as if I hadn't noticed the other man, as if I wasn't terrified out of my mind. But then, the man with the bag stopped, his eyes narrowing as he watched me. "Oh, leaving so soon?" he sneered. He took another step towards me, his expression darkening. "Thought you might stay a while. You know, talk about what's in the bag." I slid into my seat and locked the doors, my fingers trembling as I reached for the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I felt a flood of relief. But just as I was about to pull out of the lot, the man with the mask stepped into the beam of my headlights. He was holding something, a glint of metal in his hand. A knife. My heart hammered as I shifted into reverse, my eyes flicking between the man in the mask and the one with the bag, who now had that twisted smile stretched across his face. A look of dark satisfaction, like he had me exactly where he wanted me. In that moment, I didn't care about the gas or the man with the bag or anything else. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the tires squealing as I sped out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man with the bag watching me go, his figure shrinking into the darkness as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was halfway home, my heart still racing, my mind replaying every moment of that horrible encounter. It felt like a waking nightmare, something that couldn't possibly be real. But the terror in my chest, the memory of those eyes following me, it was all too real. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in my car for a long time, staring out into the empty parking lot, trying to calm down. I was safe, I told myself. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man with the bag, his mocking smile, the horrible things he'd said. I never went back to that gas station. and to this day, I don't drive at night unless I have to. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when it happened, the first incident, anyway. I was in my home office, catching up on some overdue work, with my 6-year-old daughter, Emma, playing in her room nearby. She's a curious, energetic kid, always wanting to explore, but she knew the boundaries of our property, and I never worried much about her wandering off. So when she tiptoed into my office with wide, worried eyes, I put my work aside. "Daddy, there's someone outside," she whispered, her voice laced with a fear I rarely saw. At first, I assumed she was just seeing shadows or letting her imagination run wild, as kids often do. But something in her face made me pause. "Where, honey?" She pointed toward the back garden, her hand shaking a little. "Near the trees." I got up, took her hand, and walked to the window overlooking the garden. It was misty that day, the kind of autumn fog that settles heavily around the neighborhood, muting colors and sounds. But sure enough, there was a shape, a person, standing near the edge of our yard, partially obscured by the fog. They were just standing there. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was a woman, her posture hunched, her head tilted slightly as though watching us. I knocked on the window, hoping the noise would startle her and send her on her way. And it did, sort of. She didn't run, though. Instead, she just took a slow step back into the mist, fading until she was completely swallowed by it. Emma squeezed my hand. "Who was that, Daddy?" "I'm not sure," I told her, trying to sound calm. "But don't worry. She's gone now." I didn't feel as sure as I sounded, but I forced a smile, and Emma seemed to relax. After putting her back in her room, I slipped on a coat and went outside to check. Our yard backs onto a few acres of untamed woods, and there are no neighbors for a good distance, so I wasn't expecting anyone to be wandering around back there, let alone someone who didn't seem eager to be seen. I moved cautiously, scanning the fog-laden shadows, and eventually made my way to the storage shed at the end of the yard. That's when I saw her again. She was standing just a few feet away, near the shed, her hands busy with something. It took a second to realize what it was. She was closing and opening the shed door, over and over, as if caught in some kind of repetitive trance. I took a few steps closer and cleared my throat, hoping to break whatever strange spell she seemed to be under. "Hey! Can I help you with something?" She froze, her hands still resting on the shed door. For a second, I thought she might not respond at all. But then, slowly, she turned to face me. I couldn't see her face clearly through the fog, but her posture shifted from stiff to almost apologetic. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I was looking for something." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my voice steady. "This is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, she just stood there, her shoulders slumping as if some great weight had settled on them. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back into the mist, disappearing as completely as before. I went back to the shed, half expecting to find something disturbed or taken, but everything seemed normal. I couldn't shake the strange feeling she left behind, though. There was something deeply unsettling about her, the way she moved, the vacant look in her eyes, something about it all gnawed at me. That night, after I told my wife, Laura, about it, we decided it was probably nothing. Just a lost soul wandering around, maybe someone with nowhere else to go. We double-checked the locks, tucked Emma in, and went to bed. It was just after midnight when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of knocking coming from the direction of the shed. I sat up, heart pounding. Laura was still asleep, but the noise was too loud to ignore. I slipped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and went to the window, peering out into the dark. Nothing. No sign of anyone near the shed. But the knocking continued, a steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I pulled on a pair of shoes, trying to keep quiet so as not to wake Laura or Emma, and headed outside. The air was colder than before, the fog heavier, clinging to the ground like a shroud. I followed the sound toward the shed, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the shed, I swung the flashlight around, expecting, hoping, even, to see the woman. But the place was empty. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the locked shed door as the last echoes of the tapping faded. Then, behind me, I heard something, a soft whimper. I turned to see Emma standing on the porch, clutching her stuffed bear to her chest, her face pale as a ghost. "Daddy," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's someone at my window." I raced back to the house, scooping her up and shielding her from the yard as I took her back to her room. She pointed at the window, her hand trembling. She was right there. She was trying to get in. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look. And there she was, the woman, standing just outside Emma's window. Her face was illuminated in the moonlight, gaunt and hollow, with sunken, shadowed eyes and a grimace that twisted her mouth into an almost inhuman shape. Her hair hung in matted, gray strands around her face, and her skin looked loose, as though it were slipping off her bones. She was trying to pry open the window, her bony fingers scratching at the glass. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the window from the inside. She jerked back, her head snapping up to meet my gaze, and for a moment, I could swear she recognized me. Her eyes locked onto mine with a look of desperation, a silent plea that chilled me to the core. Then she turned and ran, vanishing into the mist once more. We called the police, of course. They came, searched the yard, and found nothing but a few scattered footprints near the shed. They told us it was probably just some transient, or someone dealing with a mental illness. But I could tell from the looks they exchanged that they thought it was strange, too. Days passed, and we didn't see her again, but I started to notice things, small, inexplicable signs that she'd been back. The shed door would be slightly ajar in the mornings, even though I made sure it was locked every night. Occasionally, I'd find little piles of dirt near the window where she'd stood, or scratches on the glass that hadn't been there before. One night, about a week after the last sighting, I woke up to a strange noise, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice, whispering my name from somewhere in the house. I got up, heart pounding, and checked on Emma first. She was sound asleep, her breathing steady. But when I went to the window, I saw the shed door swinging open, slowly, as though someone were just out of sight, urging it forward with each gust of wind. The police could never find any trace of her, and each visit ended with the same vague assurances. They chalked it up to coincidence, or wear and tear, and suggested we consider moving. But this was our home. And each time the mist settled over our yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting, just out of sight. It was one of those nights that just seemed to press in on you, heavy and dark like the world had a vendetta against you. The rain was relentless, beating down on the parking lot in cold sheets, each drop hitting the asphalt with a dull, almost mocking sound. I'd just broken up with my girlfriend, hell, maybe ex-girlfriend now, and she left without a backward glance, leaving me alone in that rain-soaked lot. I was too stubborn to ask her to stay and too proud to call anyone to pick me up, so I figured I'd just walk home. It wasn't too far. A mile, maybe a bit more. I stood there, trying to shield myself from the downpour with my jacket. I'd left my umbrella back at her place, and of course, I couldn't call an Uber. My phone had died earlier, and there wasn't a single bar to charge it at that godforsaken place. So I shoved my hands into my pockets and started walking, keeping my head down to avoid the worst of the rain. The streets were empty, and everything had that weird, echoing silence that comes with late-night storms. I'd only made it a few blocks when I noticed headlights coming up behind me, cutting through the sheets of rain. The vehicle was a big, dark SUV, black, I think, though it was hard to tell with the streetlights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. It slowed down as it got closer, and I instinctively quickened my pace. It didn't take a genius to know that nothing good ever came from strange cars stopping for you in the middle of the night. But then the window rolled down, and a guy leaned out, giving me a friendly smile. There were two other guys in the car, both silent, but the driver had this easy grin that almost put me at ease. "Hey man," he called out, shouting a bit over the rain. "Need a ride? You look like a drowned rat out here." For a moment, I hesitated, glancing down the long, empty road stretching out ahead of me. I was soaked to the bone, and the prospect of a dry seat sounded too good to pass up. I figured I could always bail if things got weird. So I shrugged, muttering "Yeah, thanks," and climbed into the back seat. The moment I shut the door, though, I felt it, a shift in the air, like a subtle click as the doors locked, trapping me in that confined space. My heart rate spiked, but I tried to keep calm, reasoning with myself that I was just being paranoid. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his smile still fixed in place, but now it looked off, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. The two guys up front didn't say a word. The guy in the passenger seat, especially, seemed tense, his gaze flickering to me now and then, sizing me up. I tried to relax, leaning back, but the silence was thick, and I felt like I was being watched every second. "So, where are you headed?" the driver asked, his tone light. Just down by Willow Street," I replied, giving him the address. He nodded, tapping his fingers on the wheel in a slow, almost rhythmic pattern. But instead of taking a left at the next intersection, he kept going straight, deeper into a part of town I wasn't familiar with. "Hey, you missed the turn back there," I said, forcing a casual tone, even though my pulse was pounding hard enough for me to feel it in my ears. He glanced at me in the mirror, that same strange smile playing on his lips. "Oh, did I? Sorry, man. Must have gotten a bit turned around. Don't worry, we'll get you home." He didn't turn around. In fact, he seemed to go out of his way to avoid any streets that looked even vaguely familiar. I glanced out the window, but the rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the glass. I was about to ask him to stop, but before I could say a word, the guy in the passenger seat turned around and looked straight at me. His eyes were cold. I don't know how else to describe it. There was no friendliness, no warmth, just this calculating stare, like he was sizing me up. He had this faint smile, but it didn't feel right. None of this felt right. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I'd intended. "Can you just let me out here? I think I'll just walk the rest of the way." The driver laughed, a low, almost mocking chuckle. "Relax, man. We're just giving you a ride. No need to get jumpy." One of the guys in the back seat, sitting right next to me, shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic glinting in his hand. My heart leapt into my throat. My mind was racing, screaming at me that I'd made a huge mistake getting into this car. I reached for the door handle, fingers scrambling to find the lock. That's when I heard the click. The doors were locked. My stomach dropped. I was trapped. The driver watched me through the mirror, amusement flashing in his eyes. The guy next to me reached out, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "Where are you going in such a rush?" he murmured, his tone menacingly calm. I don't know how I did it, but adrenaline must have kicked in, because somehow, I managed to slam my elbow into his arm and wrench the lock up on the door. I yanked the handle and threw myself out into the rain, hitting the wet pavement hard. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the rain and the way my clothes clung to me, soaked and heavy. The SUV's doors flung open, and I heard them shouting, their voices swallowed by the storm. I didn't look back. I ran, feet pounding against the pavement, slipping and skidding as I went. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance between me and them as possible. I veered off the road, stumbling into the woods that bordered the road. The trees loomed around me, their branches clawing at me as I pushed through, heart racing, breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. I could hear them behind me, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, their voices low but getting closer. I don't know how long I ran. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were going to explode, but I didn't dare stop. Every time I looked back, I thought I saw shadows moving through the trees, closing in. I felt like a hunted animal. Eventually, I broke through the trees and onto another road. There were no cars, no lights, just an empty stretch of asphalt. I staggered across it, legs wobbling, and collapsed on the other side, hidden by the darkness. I lay there, trying to catch my breath, straining to hear any sounds over the rain. The SUV didn't follow me onto that road. After a while, their voices faded, and the forest swallowed up the sound of their footsteps. I stayed hidden, curled up in the wet grass, waiting until I was sure they were gone. When I finally made it home, I was too exhausted to think. But the reality hit me later, hard and cold. They could have robbed me, but they didn't. They could have done a lot of things, but they hadn't. Whatever they wanted from me, it was more than just my wallet. That thought still haunts me, even now. On a misty October morning a few years back, I found myself staying at my girlfriend Maggie's father's cabin deep in the remote forests of Maine. It was a world apart from the city, a place where you felt enveloped by the vastness of nature, nestled between towering pines and the shimmering surface of a lake that stretched far beyond sight. Her dad, Ted, owned acres of land, most of which was untouched wilderness. There were barely any signs of civilization once you went far enough into the woods. I had always enjoyed that solitude, the feeling of being away from everything. During that month, I got into the habit of taking daily walks, winding through the narrow, muddy paths that wove their way into the heart of the forest. Those walks were calming at first. I'd walk surrounded by a cathedral of trees, their branches forming a canopy that let in just enough light to keep the path visible but left everything else cloaked in shadows. Birds would occasionally call out in the silence, and if you were still enough, you could hear the subtle rustling of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. One particular morning, there was an unusual thickness to the fog. It hung low, obscuring my view just a few feet in front of me, making the forest feel like it was holding its breath. For some reason, that day felt different. It wasn't just the fog, it was the silence. Usually, there were the sounds of birds, the scurrying of squirrels, or the occasional snap of a twig. But that morning, everything was still, like the whole forest was in some sort of waiting game. Yet I was intrigued. I wanted to see how far I could go, to find the edge of this silence. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, feeling almost hypnotized by the white haze around me. As I moved, the mist seemed to grow thicker, almost suffocating. Then, about halfway down the path, I heard it, a set of footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be my own steps echoing back through the mist. But no, these footsteps had a rhythm, a distinct, slow pace that didn't quite match my own. I stopped, my heart pounding just slightly faster than before. The footsteps stopped too, leaving me in that oppressive quiet. I took a step forward, and there it was again, the crunch of leaves, just behind me. I spun around, my voice half-heartedly calling out into the mist. "Hello?" I waited, straining to catch any hint of a response, but there was only silence. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my imagination, maybe even the weird acoustics of the forest. But as I started walking again, the footsteps resumed. Always keeping pace, just behind, following like a shadow I couldn't see. I called out louder this time, hoping it was some local playing a prank. But no one answered. As I pushed on, hoping I'd outrun whatever, or whoever it was, I heard another sound. A low, guttural sigh. It was soft at first, like a whisper carried by the breeze, but it slowly grew louder, until it was unmistakable. It sounded like an old man in pain, almost like a mournful groan. I froze. Every muscle in my body screamed to turn back, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Then, through the haze, I spotted it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just barely visible through the fog. The figure didn't move, just stood there, still as the trees surrounding us. I couldn't make out any details, only the faint outline of a head, shoulders, and arms. My stomach twisted with a primal fear I couldn't explain. I felt watched, measured, and the sense of dread grew with each passing second. I decided it was time to turn back. I turned on my heel and began walking as fast as I could manage without breaking into a sprint. The footsteps behind me quickened to match my pace, not too close, but always within earshot. It was as if the figure was mimicking my movements, never letting me get too far away. I walked faster, heart pounding in my chest, trying to ignore the growing dread clawing at my thoughts. But no matter how much I sped up, the footsteps followed. Finally, my nerves gave in. I started to run, the mist parting just enough for me to see the outline of the path. My feet pounded against the dirt, breath coming in ragged gasps. And yet, the footsteps kept up, never faltering, never growing closer, but never falling behind either. It felt like some nightmarish game of tag, where the other player would never let me out of reach. Just when I thought I was finally putting distance between myself and that shadow, I glanced back, and there it was, always the same distance, like some spectral figure bound by invisible chains, never to approach, but never to leave either. The forest seemed to close in around me, trees stretching their branches overhead like skeletal arms reaching to drag me back. I don't remember the last leg of that run. I just remember bursting out of the woods, my chest heaving, the fog beginning to lift as I neared the cabin. I didn't stop until I was at the front door, panting and drenched in sweat. I risked a glance back, half hoping it was gone, but there it was, faint, almost indistinguishable in the mist, still at the edge of the forest. Watching. When I stumbled inside, Maggie was in the kitchen, and I barely got the words out as I tried to explain what I'd seen. Her father, Ted, listened too, his face growing more serious as I described the sounds, the figure. He didn't dismiss me outright, but he took a flashlight and went out, saying he'd check around, just in case. Ted came back an hour later, saying he hadn't found anything, but he did note how the fog seemed unusually thick that day, even for this part of Maine. He told me not to worry, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere and my imagination. But I knew what I'd heard and seen,